Questions? Are you standing to ask a question? No. Okay. Pixie, what are your thoughts? Bye, Capitans. Yes, indeed. Travel safely. Love to Peter and Sarah.
What about the part, and my memory's really bad,
Go ahead.
but the part of scripture that talks about an eye for an eye?
Yes, so that's the Levitical law, and I'm really glad you brought that up. So there was a law in Leviticus that is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. No, that's actually a very what that is saying is not a person is entitled to vengeance. What that is saying is let the punishment fit the crime in a civil context. There was a tradition. Actually, we look back remember we were walking through Genesis on Wednesday nights. Remember the guy Lamech, Genesis chapter 4 or 5, somewhere in there. Lamech is a descendant of Cain, and you see a little genealogy of Cain's kids, and it ends with this guy Lamech, or Lamech probably, and he builds for himself a little city, and he puts himself atop a pedestal, and he says, the Lord's vengeance on any who curses Cain is sevenfold. That's the promise that the Lord made to Cain just to protect him out of the wilderness. And Lamech says, but Lamech's vengeance is 77-fold. What we see there is actually a pattern that takes place throughout the entire ancient world up until Moses, really, of if someone does something bad to you, it is your right to extract a greater toll from them in order to keep it from happening again. And so an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth was saying, don't actually do that. If somebody takes your tooth, you don't take their face, you don't take their head, you don't take their arm, rather just take a tooth. Like, and that was a matter of civil judgment. There would have been a court. There was a court's discernment in that. It wasn't just you run up and grab the tooth from them and call that justice. It was you bring them to the Israelite court, and there was discernment enacted. And if they took your tooth, well, then you award them a tooth. So that teaching is not teaching you to take vengeance in equal part against somebody else who tells you wrong. That is actually the Lord ordering his people to not overdo vengeance, because he knows, like we talked about, our hearts are bent towards overdoing vengeance because we don't do it right.
Well, justice, I think you mean, not vengeance.
Right, yes, right. Don't let justice become vengeance is really what it comes down to. Yeah.
I've been doing it wrong all this time.
She's got a necklace of teeth.
I was wondering the same exact thing.
Fantastic question. Does that make sense to folks?
Mhm.
I can get a little rambly sometime, but I hope that makes sense. Any other questions? Alan?
In our society, it's hard for us to think that we have enemies. We know that people oppose us in many things,
Mhm.
but I think, at least in the Christian world, when we don't think of them as enemies, we think of them as political opponents.
That's often the case. In our context, our enemies often we conceive of them as the political opponents. That's correct.
Of a hard time. I was reading a Psalm 31 this morning, and it says to hate those who worship idols.
Mhm.
And I looked at the word and said, does that mean we really should hate them? Or it's just that we want, do not follow them.
Right.
I think, not that we should hate them and take out punishment upon them.
Well, that was also within the religious context of the day. So he's not saying hate every single Philistine you come across because they worship idols. He's saying Israel has been led astray into worshiping idols. We ought to hate that practice so much we want to blot it out. That's essentially what that means. And so that would be said, like within the church context, if we were going to apply that, if somebody came in and started saying, hey, we really should worship this Muhammad guy also, or this insert other religious leader also. We should hate that idea. We should cast that out.
They're hating the action, not the person.
Yeah, and I think there's I'd have to see what the actual Hebrew word is. It might be something that's translated hate in the sense of like hate them in a non-Christian way. It might be more of a matter of like abhor that person's actions along those lines. I don't know. I can't answer that question. I'm not sure. But we are called, I mean, we're called right here. Abhor what is evil, bless those who persecute you, do not curse them, bless and do not curse. Jesus says, you've been told, love your enemies and hate your, you've been told, love your neighbors and hate your enemies, love your friends, hate your enemies. But I tell you, love your enemies as yourself. So Jesus, it's a matter of where the Levitical law was not wrong, but it had been misapplied for a long period of time in a personal way, and Jesus is sort of correcting the misapplication. So we are never commanded by God to hate someone in the sense of we desire their ultimate destruction. We're called to hate. If we're called to hate somebody in Scripture, it's usually hate that for which they stand until they are called to the Lord. That's what
In the church, it's hard for us to think of ourselves as having enemies,
Mhm.
right? I think, at least personally, I tend to go toward the let it all go away. Like, I'm not going to talk about them or I'm just going to create distance, right?
Yeah.
And I use distance as this like safe zone.
Mhm.
And pretend that there's not conflict. And this is saying, like, basically, no, you have to go in and intentionally bless them. Leaving a safe zone is not what we're called to.
Now, I also want to say there is a command in here, which we're going to cover in more detail next week. Live peaceably with all, insofar as it depends on you. And so, yes, by all means, if somebody is making themselves an enemy to you, it is your responsibility to seek to bless them. It's also your responsibility to take a step or two into living peaceably with them, find reconciliation, all that jazz like we talked about earlier. But if they deny it, you've done all you were called to do. It is not on you to make that person reconcile with you.
Yeah, I think I use it more as just an
Escape.
escape.
Yes.
I am conflict avoidant, and so I don't want to deal with this, and so I'll pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It-
No. The Bible unfortunately calls us to the hard work of reconciliation, not the lazy work of let it pass away.
I
Yeah.
kind of do what Cheryl does, but I still stew about it.
Yeah.
It's like,
And-
it's still
and-
like
and-
turning in my head.
And who suffers? That person? You. Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
ah.
And so if you, I mean, honestly, it's both good and holy and reflects the Lord, but it's also good for you. Like if you're stewing on it, that's only harming you and your heart. You start praying for the other person's blessing and seek reconciliation insofar as it depends on you. You can, like, your conscience becomes clear. Like, I've done what I can. That person doesn't want to accept it. Okay, that's fine. At that point, it's the water off the duck's back.
But it's hard to label them as an enemy. And I think, like, I just
Yeah.
love that you said that. If there's this
Mhm.
like mind thing of enemies bad. I can't have enemies.
I just looked up the notes on 31, and it says hate, refuse to be associated with. So
Ouch.
you're not hating a person, but you're refusing to be associated
With that
with what
sin.
they are doing.
Right.
Or associated.
Thank you for looking that up. I would have to look it up later, but we have a good note there. Thank you. Where were we on the, yes, so, and I think, yeah, and again, in all these things, discernment, like you in any given situation, I don't know what position you're in. Have you taken a step to reconcile with the other person? Are you praying for their blessing and all that jazz? Like, all I can say is, look, this is the teaching, apply it. If you're in a situation where this is the case, pray for their blessing, seek reconciliation. If they deny it, they deny it, but continue to pray for their blessing, because that's only going to benefit your heart at the very, very least.
So on Zoom. There's a whole lot more. Hold on. Wow. Okay, so Becky and Daniel, Shawnee, a primitive root to hate personally, enemy, foe, be hateful, odious, utterly. Oh, they just.
It's the Strong's concordance definition. I'll do some more research on that word and that passage, and I'll come back to you with some more thoughts on
Yeah,
it
they
later.
put a bunch of translations in here.
Thank you very much. Could have one of ask Whoever sent that, Becky or Daniel, could you text me the strong concordance number, please? You'll know what, they know what that means. Thank you. Any other questions? And then if not, we're gonna close out because we have other things to get to.
I was thinking about the, recently, the fellow that, the truck driver. Was an immigrant and his son was in the truck with him and some guy was braking in front of him. And aggravating him because he was just really ticking him off. And if he had turned away and just refused to be associated, he'd be alive today.
Right.
But instead he confronted him and I don't know what he thought he was gonna do. Tell him off, I guess,
Yeah,
or
no.
something. But the guy reacted unbelievably harshly
Mhm.
and wow. And he lost his life because of it.
Yeah.
Didn't pay.
I think we're gonna close there. If you have more questions about some of the specifics, feel free to talk to me and or Dave after the service.